why did He do it this way? It's okay to ask God, why did you do it this way? Why the death of Jesus? Why is it fitting that the author of salvation, as He leads many sons to glory, why is it fitting that He be perfected? And what does that mean? Through sufferings.
Why did God save us the way He did? Or put another way, why did Christ have to suffer in order to bring us to glory? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper explores the surprising greatness of our salvation from Hebrews 2. This sermon was originally preached at Bethlehem Baptist Church on June 2nd, 1996.
The book of Hebrews is one extended effort not to neglect the greatness of salvation. It is one long meditation on the magnificence of Jesus Christ and what He has wrought through His death and resurrection for you and me. So if you want to know, how do you not neglect your great salvation? Let the book of Hebrews model for you how not to neglect your great salvation. That's what he's doing here. Look at verse 10 again. Connect it now with verse 9. At the end of verse 9, he says that Christ tasted death for us. And now comes an explanation or a reason in this weighty verse. For it was fitting. I'm going to come back to that word. That's a surprising word. That God acts in fit ways. You say, that's odd. I mean, God's God, right? He acts, and what He acts is fit. So what's this declaring that God is acting in a fitting way? For it was fitting for Him, for God, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory. That's our great salvation. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting to perfect the author of their salvation, that's Jesus, through sufferings. I think it's amazing that this writer should say, God acted in a fitting way. Or it is fitting that He acted the way He acted. Because to me, I'm prone to simply say, look, you don't probe into whether what God has done is fitting. God did it. That's God. You don't ask that question. Is it fitting that God did it that way? But this writer evidently thinks it's okay to ask that question. Is this a fitting way to do salvation? And you know why he does that? Because it's one way of not neglecting your great salvation. It's one way of saying, is it really great, God? Is it really great the way you did it? Show me that the way you did it is really great. Show me that the way you did it is especially in ways that my human brain may not even jump to, fitting for you to do it that way. I think that's what's going on here. The fittingness that he's talking about at the beginning of verse 10 is a way of saying, here's how not to neglect the greatness of your salvation. Here's how to get in and start asking the questions, why did He do it this way? It's okay to ask God, why did you do it this way? Why the death of Jesus? Why is it fitting that the author of salvation, as He leads many sons to glory, why is it fitting that He be perfected? And what does that mean? Through sufferings. This writer is bold to ask God that question. Why is that fitting? And we are asking it right now. And I'm going to use the rest of my time to give you 3 reasons why it is fitting for Jesus to lead to glory, you and me, through being perfected by sufferings. Why is that fitting? Number 1. Now, let me preface this. that these are not the only three reasons why it's fitting. Elsewhere in the book of Hebrews, you could pile up several more reasons why it's fitting. So don't, when we're done with these three, say, oh, he didn't mention the most obvious one, because I'm not going to mention the most obvious one. You can decide what the most obvious one is. I'm going to mention the ones that are in this text. Okay? Because we got lots more to do in Hebrews, and we don't have to say everything at once. All right. Number one, here's the reason why, first reason why it is fitting that the Son of God be perfected through sufferings in bringing many sons to glory. To answer the question, we need to ask, what does it mean he was perfected? That's a troubling word, right? Perfected, you mean he was imperfect, and then he got perfected through sufferings. So we got an imperfect Son of God, Jesus, and he gets perfected through sufferings. Is that the way to understand perfected? The main problem with that is the book of Hebrews, more than any other book in the New Testament, insists on the sinlessness of Jesus from the word go. Chapter 4, verse 16, he was tempted like we are, yet without sin. Chapter 9, verse 14, he presented himself as a lamb without blemish. Chapter 7, verse 24, he was offered up to God as one who was separated from sinners. So 3 times at least, that's more than any other book in the New Testament, Jesus is declared to be sinless, perfect. So what does it mean that he was perfected through sufferings? And the answer is given in chapter 5. You want to turn there with me? You can. Chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. I love the way the Bible interprets the Bible. The Bible is the answer to the Bible. If you have problems in one part of the Bible, hang on. The Lord will give you light in other parts of the Bible. Let's read verses 8 and 9 of Hebrews 5. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And now that's interpreted for us. And having been made perfect, so learning obedience and being made perfect are mutually interpreting. Having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. So my interpretation of becoming perfect means, or is, learning obedience through what he suffered. Now that does not mean he was disobedient and then he got spanked by suffering and turned into an obedient son. What it means is this: Jesus Christ came into the world as a human being untested through suffering. He'd never known a moment of suffering in all eternity. Would he obey under sufferings? Would he hold true? Would he be a man of faith? Would he rest in his Father? Would he be perfected in the sense that he proves through suffering he is whole, he is complete? It isn't that he was defective and became perfect, but that he was untested and became perfect. That's the key here. And it is so important. And the reason it's important is because seeing this answers the question of why it was fitting for him to suffer. And here's the reason. In leading many sons to glory, the captain and the forerunner needed to experience what we experience and succeed where we failed. We came into the world, were tested and failed over and over. We just sang it. What did one of those verses say? Tested, tried, and often failing. And when I sang that this morning, I just smiled real big and I said, never Jesus. Never Jesus. Tested, tried, and never failing. Tested, tried, and never failing. So he's our forerunner in the sense that he came in, he took our nature upon him, everything minus sin, tempted in every point like as we are, and yet resisting right up to the end, breaking through sinlessly through death into glory. And it was so fitting then that one like that would lead us to glory, that he would take on our sufferings, that he would be tested and tried like we are and never fail, so that now we in him will join him in glory. So the first reason for why it's so fitting that our captain, our forerunner, is perfected through sufferings is that he needed to succeed at what we failed at, namely obedience through trial. And he did by faith in his heavenly Father. Here's reason number 2. It is fitting for Jesus to be perfected through suffering and lead many sons to glory because, this is a little bit difficult, hang on, see if you can get this. It is unspeakably, marvelously the will of God, the creator of all things. It is the will of God to have a family in which the brothers and sisters, the children, are so united, so empathetically united, so sympathetically united, so deeply, personally, lovingly united that the unity would be jeopardized if only one did not experience the suffering that every other one experienced. In other words, a second reason for why it's fitting for Jesus to be perfected through sufferings is because he wants to be a good older brother. Now, where do I get that from this text? I get it from the connection between verses 10 and 11. Verse 10 says that it's fitting for God to bring many of us to glory through sufferings, many sons, family members, siblings, to glory through the sufferings of his Son with a capital S. So he got little sons and daughters and one big older son. Now, look at verse 11 and the reason, the support that's given for that statement. For both he who sanctifies, that's Jesus, and those who are sanctified, the brothers and sisters that he's leading to glory, are all from one. Now you see Father, at least if you have the NASB, is in italics. If you got NIV, it's not in italics. It's not in the original. It just says from one. Might mean Father. Might mean one human nature. The point is, there is a profound unity between the sanctifier Jesus and the sanctified us. And that unity is given as the ground for why it's fitting for the Son to be perfected through sufferings. That's the link between 10 and 11. And then it supports it by simply quoting Psalm 22 where Jesus cries out and says, I will proclaim thy name, O God, to my brethren. So when this writer read that, and he knew that Jesus had quoted Psalm 22 to apply to himself, when he read it, he just soared and said, I'm his brother. I'm his brother. I mean, he just couldn't get over it that in coming into humanity and leading many sons with a little s to glory, he was aligning himself in a family and he was creating a family. And evidently, it is fitting that the older brother not get off scot-free. What kind of fellowship is that? Big brother, come on now, come on little brother. Say, yeah, but you never. And he says, oh yes, I did. You don't ever have to have that breach in the fellowship between the big older brother, son with a capital S, and all of us sons and daughters down here with little s, little d, saying, yeah, but he never knew what it was to suffer like we had to suffer, so what kind of fellowship can we have? There's something fitting in the mind of our God. Let this minister to you right now about the nature of God. The nature of God, that God, the maker of all things and the sustainer of the universe regards it as fitting that you have an older brother who can empathize with every weakness. There's something that tells you about God. That's reason number 2 that is fitting. Last one, number 3. It is fitting that Jesus be perfected through sufferings in leading many sons to glory It's fitting because the sufferings of Jesus magnify the worth of God more than anything else. Now, that sounds like it comes out of John Piper's theology rather than out of the text, which is something I'm very afraid of doing. And so I want to show you and see whether you see what I see in this text. Look at verse 10 very carefully. For it was fitting for Him, that's God the Father, for whom are all things. Now just stop right there and let that hit you. The fittingness of the sufferings of the Son of God flows from God being a kind of God for whom are all things. Let me say that again. This is very important. What makes the suffering of the Son of God fitting as He leads many sons to glory is that the God who is designing that is the kind of God for whom are all things. What's that mean? For whom are all things? It means, don't let me read anything in here now. You tell me. It means everything exists. You exist, I exist, salvation exists, Jesus exists to call attention to God. To call attention to the glory of God. Not to improve upon God. I don't improve upon God. My salvation doesn't improve upon God. It gets attention for the unimprovability of God. Everything is for God. So, God, pondering how to save the human race, says, it will be fitting if I save them in a way that is for me. That's what's in that phrase. For whom are all things. Now, get this. When Jesus suffered, evidently, it showed the glory of God. Why? If you read the rest of the book of Hebrews, I love this book. I can almost cry over this book because as you read the rest of the book of Hebrews, what you find is that at the horizontal level, what enables you to glorify God is by suffering with the confidence that glory is coming. You see it over and over again in the book of Hebrews. Chapter 10, verse 32. They suffered and rejoiced over the plundering of their property because they looked to the reward of the glory. Chapter 11, verse 24, Moses suffered and took upon himself the sin of the people and suffered because he looked to the reward of the glory. Chapter 13, verses 5 and 6, don't be in love with money. Be radically risk-taking because God has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. My glory will be your portion. Chapter 13, verses 12 and 13, the one who sanctifies you went outside the city to suffer for you. Let us go with Him outside the city because we look for a city whose builder and maker is God beyond this world. What sustains Christians in glorifying God in the book of Hebrews is the hope of glory. So when you get to chapter 12, and Jesus says, or it says about Jesus, He endured the cross, despising the shame, which is like He's not ashamed to call us brethren here, despising the shame, for the joy that was set before Him, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. The joy of what? What joy sustained Him through the cross? The joy of sitting in the glory of His Father, surrounded by many sons and daughters, worshiping the King of glory. That's what sustained Him, which is why the sufferings of Jesus magnify the glory of God. The reason the sufferings of Jesus magnify the glory of God and show that everything is for the glory of God is because what sustained Jesus through suffering was the worth of the glory He was aiming for and bringing people to. Which is the end of my sermon now. Here we are. The most precious, the most glorious, the most wonderful thing about our great salvation, and the reason we should not neglect it, is because our salvation is salvation for the glory of our great God. From beginning to end is God in this great salvation. So I plead with you, as I will plead with you as long as we're in the book of Hebrews, don't neglect this great salvation. If you're an unbeliever in this room right now, would you please not neglect this great salvation? The reason you're here this morning is because God is moving in your life to get you to hear His invitation to you to believe this. That's why you're here. To rest in this. And I invite you to receive it, to believe it, to trust Jesus Christ, to embrace Him as Savior and Lord. And believer, don't neglect this great salvation. Be vigilant. Take what you've seen. Let Hebrews model for you how to meditate upon the glory of your great salvation.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper will preach a sermon titled, He Delivers from the Fear of Death, the final sermon in our 12-part series, Listen to Jesus. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.